The Sun, Martina Bett, and political editor, geopolitics, it's Ava Santina. Evans, great to have you both with us this Sunday. What should we kick off with the front page of the Sunday Times, actually? High-level talks between the US and Iran. It's the first time since 1979. There's no deal currently. That broke down spectacularly. But this has potential to shape what happens next, because we are in that period, aren't we, Ava, of that ceasefire, which is, on paper, 2 weeks in all.
Not ongoing in Lebanon, though, to remember that. You know, they are still experiencing a bombing campaign from Israel as we speak right now. And actually, you know, so looking at the Sunday Times here, there's some real optimism in the journalism here, which is, you know, that US and Iran have sat down to these historic peace talks. There's a quote here from the Pope, you know, end the madness. And what we found out in the last couple of hours is actually the only thing that's ended are the peace talks. So JD Vance has given a press conference overnight. It was rather brief, where he essentially said, we failed to reach an agreement. There were 2 sticking points. We're not entirely confident on what those are, but we think he alluded that it's around the nuclear programme. So Iran have decided that actually they do not want to concede to the US efforts to curtail the enrichment of uranium in Iran. Whether they are actually enriching uranium, we're not even entirely sure, but why not just go and bomb it anyway and then find out later? I think that was the Iraq strategy. Bad news for the USA, says JD Vance, but it's even worse news for Iran. So who knows what's going to happen over the coming days? You know, Trump flip-flops. He might decide that actually it's time to reinvigorate the bombing.
Yeah. Martina?
I just think it's very interesting what Donald Trump said overnight, where he was like, it made no difference. These talks made no difference because we have already won. I mean, I don't know what these talks meant for the ceasefire, what happens next, because no sides have confirmed what the next steps are. So it just feels like we're back to square one. Like, no question that Iran is now in a weaker position, but at the same time, we're back to, like, before, like, the bombing started 6-7 weeks ago, when there were talks and the US wanted a commitment from Iran that they were enriching the nuclear program, and Iran was saying, well, no. So it's very hard to see what happens next, and whether the ceasefire continues, and what it means for Western countries with the Strait of Hormuz still shut.
Several points that I find really interesting is number one, that JD Vance actually has been binded into the peace talks in Islamabad. You know, we haven't heard much from him. Does that speak to the fact that he wasn't quite keen on the campaign in Iran and teaming up with Israel? And then when you have peace talks in a very public stage, you know, usually peace talks, history tells us peace talks behind closed doors work better than peace talks that are in front of the public. We hear press conferences, as we did with JD Vance. And what that says to, before going into Martina's point, I suppose, with Trump posting on Truth Social saying that Iran, ahead of the talks, has no cards here. I find that quite interesting.
It does really feel that the US are attempting to control the narrative on these peace talks. You know, holding them publicly, tweeting or posting on Truth Social throughout them does indicate that perhaps they're trying to quell the markets, but they're also trying to calm fears amongst the US around the upcoming midterms.
Sure.
You know, I mean, one of the big promises from the incoming MAGA administration was that there wouldn't be any foreign wars, and that's why we understand that JD Vance had no interest in pursuing the original campaign alongside Israel in Iran, because it would upset domestic Americans. You know, this is not what the US taxpayers want their money being spent on at this time. So, but yeah, again, interesting Vance was sent over there in the first place. He has actually said that he was speaking to the president throughout those talks. They went on for 21 hours and there were several breaks, and he was reporting back to the president. But then I have to say, you know, there was a little huddle that was done with the press and the president just outside you. There was a very loud helicopter blowing in the background. But I think that, you know, the sort of the gist of what Trump was saying was he's not really too bothered either way. I mean, a totally bizarre thing to say, you know, during the middle of some peace talks.
Yeah, I think the midterms will be so interesting. Whether, you know, Middle America, let alone MAGA, will be behind the president at this point, and what that says to a potential, you know, president in JD Vance, whether he's looking ahead and thinking, actually, in 2028, this might be my moment.
And in terms of our relationship with the US, it's quite interesting. I was speaking to some US sources a few weeks ago, and they were saying that come May, come the midterms, actually we're going to see the US probably going further to the right and the UK government actually going further to the left. So the split between the UK and US special relationship might even be...
Really interesting.
Yeah,
really interesting.
It's quite an interesting thought.
That actually leads us really quite nicely to the front page of the Sunday Times. Martina, U-turn, of all U-turns, this is Kemi Badenoch talking about the PM's plans for the Chagos Islands.
That's right. So there was a legislation in the House of Lords to ratify the Chagos deal that had been put on ice, despite the fact that Number 10 kept saying there was no pause. I think a Foreign Office minister a few months ago said that the legislation had been put on ice because Donald Trump changed his mind on the deal, calling it a great act of stupidity. And then Number 10 basically said, absolutely not, there's no pause. Turns out there is a pause because now the legislation is going to run out of time. There's the King's speech on in the first 2 weeks of May, and they're not bringing it back in the King's speech. Now, Number 10 says that it doesn't mean that if they do find a way forward with the US, they won't bring it back in the next parliamentary session, but it's very clear that the US and the UK do not agree on this, that they haven't found a way to convince Donald Trump to be on board. And this is very significant because the Chagos Islands is very important because of on Diego Garcia, there's a key UK-US military base. And lots of ministers say that it's very important for national security, and that's why they put forward the deal. Now, I don't know what's going to happen going forward and how we're going to be able to secure this military base. Again, we reported in The Sun a few weeks ago Donald Trump might be thinking of buying the UK-US military base. Now, what that means, how he can do that, it's not exactly clear. But it's I think this story just, like, you know, the rift between Donald Trump and Keir Starmer is very real in the sense that things like this ever happened, and there's no way forward.
It's so interesting, isn't it, Ava? Because obviously it's political, but at the heart of this is also a human story, unfinished business from the 1970s, where islanders were forcibly removed. And I don't see that much in much of the coverage and the issues that brings up. Not least for the Prime Minister as well.
Yeah, absolutely. There's sort of the morality side of it, where you've got 10,000 people who were forcibly displaced by the UK. And there was the sort of a humanitarian argument that wasn't particularly well made by Keir Starmer when he was originally introducing this legislation. But, you know, certainly, you know, there's around 3,000 Chagosians who are living around Crawley, which is sort of near Gatwick, in the south of the UK. They haven't had their concerns heard. You would argue that perhaps they should have been allowed to have some kind of referendum. The basis argument there is really interesting because that's one where Donald Trump might have been able to sympathise with Keir Starmer. You know, we were maintaining this base on Mauritius because the US would have been allowed to use it. We would have facilitated their use of it. But in recent weeks, you know, we've had this huge dilemma with the special relationship with the US, where we prevented Trump from using certain bases around, well, that would have had access to the Gulf states. Huge moment here for Donald Trump, actually. Can I just buy the base, not have to negotiate with the UK going forward? You know, I don't want to have to negotiate a base in Cyprus when I can just have my own. Could be a good moment for him.
Yeah, often you think the world is like a monopoly board. Is that how the president views these strategic positions?
It's New York real estate everywhere, really, isn't it?
Wow. Let's move on now. Is this what we're moving on to? Fuel protests. This is front page of The Telegraph. You know, we're all feeling this at the moment. Whether it's unleaded, whether it's diesel, it's shot up. And whether you change your habits, I've found that I'm not filling up the tank entirely at the moment. I'm doing a bit as I go by, but the reporting here on the front page of the Sunday Times, fuel protests loom as diesel hit £2 a litre. Extraordinary times, isn't it?
Extraordinary times. I think it's a very important story. And he says that basically fuel protesters are planning these demonstrations across Britain as the price of diesel has surged past the £2. And discussions are happening among farming organisations as a result of what happened in Ireland as well. We've seen farming organisations you know, for farmers, hauliers, diesel is very important, and farming organisations have mobilised very well for the inheritance tax protest. So there's quite a lot of concern in government that this could happen. There's lots of pressure on Keir Starmer to do something on fuel duty because they are bringing an end to the 5p fuel duty cut that was introduced by Rishi Sunak in 2022 as a result of the Ukraine war. I think it's not a very good position for, like, they are going to have to change their mind on this. Obviously, they say that everything is under review, but with stuff like this happening, with the cost of Keir Starmer's own cost of living advisor, Richard Walker, the Iceland chief executive, saying, yeah, you've got to do something because look at what I think Australia has introduced a fuel duty cut as well in the last few weeks. So it's really hard to see how they won't move on it, but I think they need to do it soon before stuff like this
But not
happens.
even just that, you know, the other thing that Australia have done is they've said, actually, if you don't need to drive your car, don't drive your car.
I thought that was really interesting from Anthony Albanese, actually, because his message was, you know, quite stark, direct, whereas the messaging here from the government, well, we haven't heard much on changing habits.
I think that there's probably a panic that we might do a repeat of the beginning of COVID or even during the Blair years.
So a delayed
where,
response.
You know, where you have people queuing up at petrol pumps and then, you know, in turn, when supplies then get low, that's going to bolster the price even more. But one of the biggest issues here, where I think people will really feel it for years to come, is the transport of our food. You know, that's, you know, the hauliers who are now paying extra for their fuel, that cost is going to be handed over to the consumer, and those costs are really stubborn. That inflation takes a really long time to come back down again. You know, in a year's time, you'll still be potentially adding 10 pence to every loaf of bread that you want to eat as a direct result of this.
OK, Ava, Martina, thanks so much for your company. We've run out of time. We'll have more at the top of the hour. Thanks so much.
The best thing about being a Sky News journalist